that there's very little weight or embellishment on the flogging scene or the crucifixion scene. What we're focusing on in the whole of the Passion narrative is not the flogging or the actual execution, but the way Jesus was mocked. That's where a lot of detail comes in all the Gospels, but Matthew included. And there are three mocking scenes. The first is after the high priest's condemnation. Historically, it is possible that he might have been slapped or roughed up a bit by one of the attendants or two of the attendants. But we really don't think that, as it says, they spat on his face and hit him with their fists. And others said, as they struck him, "Play the prophet, Christ, Messiah, who hit you?" It's placed in there because of Matthew uses mockery to show us that really these human beings are saying things which they don't realise are supremely true. They're pretending he's a false prophet, the Messiah, all of that. But isn't that who he is? The prophet, the Messiah, the Christ. Okay, the next mocking scene is after the Roman trial. I should just say this little bit too. At the Roman trial, there's just a single sentence in all the Gospels about Jesus being flogged. That's all. Here in Matthew it goes like this: "Having had Jesus flogged, he gave him over in order that he be crucified." So what the Stations of the Cross have done, of course, is focus on that, as is Mel Gibson's Passion, the Passion. But really, in the Gospels, there's not a focus on that. There's a focus on who is this person that's being executed. Anyway, after the flogging, and flogging, by the way, it seems was always part of the execution process. So it's not an extra thing. In St. John's Gospel, it has, we'll have him flogged and then see if they'll release him. They might have a bit of tenderness towards him. Now, how it happened is more than likely that he was flogged after he was condemned to death. And then it says this: "Then the soldiers of the governor, taking Jesus into the praetorium, gathered together the whole cohort against him." Gathered together, the word is synagogue, which means, of course, gather together, but also we think a little bit of the Jewish gathering. They placed on him a scarlet cloak, on his head a crown of thorns. They placed a reed for a scepter in his hands. Then they knelt before him and they acclaimed him as king. And then they abused him. They spat and they beat his head. But the mockery, of course, is the key thing. And they're mocking him as a king. But you and I know he really is their king. And his kingdom will last forever. Interestingly, just a small point, but both the Jewish authorities and the Roman, the Gentile authorities, mock Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, so they equally share in guilt, if you like, but just in being part of the death process. But then there's the final mocking. That's when he's on the cross. The passers-by, the chief priests and the elders, etc., and even the robbers mock him. And in each of these mockeries, titles are imposed on Jesus, which of course are profoundly true. He destroyed this temple. If he is the Son of God, wouldn't he come down from the cross? He saved others. He's a saviour. Couldn't he save himself? If he's the King of Israel, the Son of God, and so on. Little do they know that the words they say are true in a deeper way than they believed. How did Jesus die? This is the second last thing you'll be delighted to know. Jesus was led out of the city, it says, to the place of execution. Normally, there was a vertical cross at the place of execution, and the person who was to be executed carried behind the nape of his neck the crossbeam itself. They got a passerby, Simon of Cyrene. Well, there was a whole Jewish colony in Cyrenaica, the capital of Cyrene, and they had a Jewish a synagogue themselves in Jerusalem. So it's quite possible that Simon of Cyrene helped Jesus carry that cross. And his two children are mentioned in one of the Gospels, Rufus and Alexander. We wonder why this is all remembered. It's possible that they became Christians, and that's why they're there. The crucifixion was a public event, so there of course would have been the soldiers, there would have been passers-by, there would have been onlookers. Although the way they're painted in the Gospel has a little bit to do with the way onlookers are painted in the Old Testament as they look at the suffering servant. We're a bit unsure though whether the family and friends were there, because in some crucifixion events around this time, no member of the family is allowed anywhere near the place. What are his last words? You might remember that that's a beautiful part of the musical tradition, the 7 last words of Jesus. Well, what did he say? Well, if you add up all the different Gospels, there are 7 different things. But what really happened? Well, in the way that Matthew and Mark portray it is Jesus says one thing. Now it may have been he said nothing, like the suffering servant. It may have been. It may have been he just gave a loud cry without any word being formulated, just a loud cry. Or it may have been he yelled out, Eli, Ata, a Hebrew phrase meaning, you are my God, which in Aramaic, the local language, is very close to the word Elijah. That may have been there. Or he may have called out what is said in Matthew and Mark, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me? A phrase from the Psalms. Jesus dies in utter desolation. The cause of death, shock. Not asphyxiation, shock because of immense dehydration and loss of blood. Okay, just the last thing I'd like to say a little bit about is the resurrection. How does Matthew speak of the resurrection? Well, as in the infancy narratives, there are 5 scenes you'll be delighted to know. The 5 scenes are: Jesus is buried by a disciple, Joseph. Then the baddies come on the scene, the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they place a guard at the tomb because they don't want him to get out of it. And then a lovely scene, the resurrection itself. The women arrive, angels frighten the guards, and they tell the women that Jesus is risen, and then Jesus appears to them. The resurrection scene. And then the baddies again. The guards are bribed by the Sanhedrin to lie about the body because it's disappeared. So we'll give you some money to tell them that his disciples came. And that's of course the story that the Jewish people still say. They're the baddies again. But finally, the extraordinary scene of Jesus on the mountain and commissioning the disciples to become apostles and go out to the whole Gentile world and make disciples and baptize them and teach them all that we've done. So could I just say a little brief word about the resurrection, the middle one, and about the last one, the commissioning on the mountain. Now, in Matthew's Gospel, the earth quakes at the resurrection.